Difficulty is one of the most impactful elements of any video game. It's such an important aspect, in fact, that the difficulty of a game can define a game's entire player base. Many games are almost solely known for their either very high or relatively low levels of difficulty, and striking a balance on that delicate difficulty scale remains one of the larger challenges game devs face when making a game. There's a reason there's been so much talk about difficulty in games in the media, and why game critics have been very heavily criticized recently for improperly portraying the difficulty of games. The perceived difficulty of a game to an audience is a large factor of whether or not they want to play or will enjoy a game. Roguelikes, being a game genre, also must tackle this dilemma of difficulty, and if you've ever played a roguelike, you most likely know the difficulty many of them have settled on. While the individual games in the roguelike genre might not be the most difficult compared to other games in other genres, collectively they are pretty well known for being one of the more consistently difficult genres overall. I've seen many people voice how difficult the games can get online, and I can certainly say from my own experience that easy roguelikes are few and far between. Of course, this doesn't mean the games are bad by any means. In fact, their consistency and relatively high difficulty is one of the things I admire most about the genre. But through the many hours I've spent trying to master these seemingly unmasterable games, I've always had to wonder, why? Why is it that the roguelike genre, a genre with a formula that seems so cut and dry, a genre with repetitive, practicable gameplay, a genre that often contains games that don't seem to have the size and grandeur to present a huge challenge to players, why do roguelikes still feel so difficult? Well, there's several very interesting reasons, and lucky for you, I'll be diving into that exact topic. To tackle this debacle of difficulty, I've got 4 main points that address why roguelikes seem so difficult. So, to start off, a large reason I think roguelikes feel so difficult is due to something called the learning curve. In this context, the learning curve is essentially a representation of the correlation of time spent on a game and how much you learn about that game in that time. This differs a bit from the actual mathematical theory of the learning curve, but it holds a similar premise here. It's basically a way to judge the rate at which you learn and become more proficient at a game as you continue to play through the game. And pretty much every game out there has a learning curve, albeit on varying levels. Games like Power Wash Simulator or Untitled Goose Game have more short and shallow learning curves, for instance, meaning that while there is some things you have to learn and master about the games, overall, after just a little while, you've pretty much mastered everything you need in the games. Whereas games like Dark Souls and Sekiro have very long and broad learning curves, meaning it takes a lot more time and effort to learn and master the games and their mechanics. Roguelikes, as you've probably guessed, generally also have a very long learning curve, and it's one of the big reasons that the genre feels so difficult to master. Most roguelike games have a plethora of content and mechanics that the player has to learn to succeed, and the games often deliver this information at a relatively slow rate. Progress in roguelikes is notoriously slow, as roguelikes differ from other game genres in that they essentially have to take a 2 or 3 hour long game, aka getting to the end of a run, and make it last much longer. This, among other ways, is often accomplished by making progression through the runs of said roguelike very difficult, and as a result, slow, especially initially. I mean, how fun would a roguelike be if you could just easily get to the final boss on your first run? With this slow progress also comes slow learning, as you have to continuously loop again and again to inch your way through difficult new enemies and areas you'll have to learn how to master. And these games rarely, if ever, do any handholding, so you're usually on your own to figure out how to deal with that. This all culminates in roguelikes often requiring very large time sinks in order to truly master the whole of their mechanics and gameplay, and thereby make the game easier to play, resulting in a prolonged feeling of the games feeling very difficult. To better explain this, I'll use Risk of Rain 2 as a quick example. When I first started playing Risk of Rain 2, I could barely beat the game on the Drizzle difficulty, the easiest difficulty the game has. In fact, just getting through the first couple of stages was rare, and for the first tens of hours of my time in the game, actually finishing a run at all felt like such a monumental task. And among other factors I will get into, a large reason for this is I just really didn't know how to play Risk of Rain 2. Now sure, I knew what the goal was and the general idea of shoot bad thing, get item and teleport, but there are so many nuances the game had beyond that I just didn't understand for a long time, because I hadn't spent enough time playing, experiencing, and practicing in order to learn these things. Pacing, scrapping, survivor text, lunar altar locations, hidden items, teleporter management, enemies to target and how to beat them, many of these things and more I had no idea about and had to slowly learn over the course of my time in the game. And slowly is a key word here, because it took at least a couple runs to pick up on just one new skill, and adding all the things I had to learn together along with how little progress I was making initially meant that the game just felt so impossibly difficult when I first started playing. Every time I learned a new skill and progressed a little farther in, I was introduced to 10 new problems, and working my way to the top of the learning curve took a lot of hours. And I'm still honestly not even there yet. I mean, heck, I've barely touched Eclipse. While Risk of Rain 2 is of course its own unique game, this incredibly long learning curve is a sentiment I share across most every other roguelike I've ever played, and is in my opinion a large contributor to their difficulties. Enter the Gungeon, Wizard of Legend, Noita, Hades, Isaac, Spelunky, many of these games and more all felt so intimidating when first playing them, in large part because of the vast unknown I had to slowly play through and learn about. But, to be honest, even though it may sound like this is a negative aspect of the games, it's actually an aspect that I wouldn't want to play a roguelike without. It provides a fun, challenging level of difficulty, promoting exploration and discovery as well as finding unique tactics for the situations blindly thrown at you. And also results in a very satisfying, albeit sometimes gruesome, time sink, which is nice. A+. However, more than a learning curve goes into the difficulty of a roguelike, and sometimes it's not something the player can control, which leads me into my next piece of the roguelike difficulty puzzle: RNG. By this point, you might be thinking, okay, so once I play a ton of hours of a roguelike, it will become more and more easy on a never-ending scale. I've now crossed the learning curve and have mastered all the game has to teach, and from now on I can just experience smooth, easy sailing. Wrong. I still have countless failed runs and roguelikes I've spent way too many hours mastering. How is this possible? Me, the absolute pinnacle of modern roguelike gaming, an utter master of all things procedural and permanently dead, losing? Like, kinda maybe not the best player, but it's also in large part because of roguelike's heavy luck elements. Now, I want to clarify that I don't mean that roguelikes are just entirely luck, but pretty much every roguelike out there has a decently sized inherent aspect of RNG. The items you're given are random, or the enemies you face are random, or the maps you traverse are random, or your starting kit is random. Lots of elements of a roguelike are random, as that is a core piece of what makes a roguelike, hint hint, procedural generation. With this procedural generation, however, also comes the fact that some runs are just unfairly hard. Even if you play absolutely out of your mind for an entire run, some runs are just not feasible because you didn't get any good items, you got a horrible enemy spawn, you got a horrible map layout, etc. This is a unique element compared to a lot of other game genres, and because of its relative novelty, along with the general gaming stigmatism of it's not RNG, you're just bad, often roguelikes can feel unexplainably unfairly difficult at times. And because it's something that truly is out of the player's control, it can feel like roguelikes are just harder than other games, which don't often have such a mechanic so intrinsically tied to their genre. Now of course, this also means the inverse. Some runs are basically handed to me on a silver platter, and then I'm like, where's the challenge? 4/5 of my Isaac runs. But considering that the mind often remembers bad memories over good ones, and because there's generally more that can go wrong in a roguelike than right, usually people will find themselves on the unfairly hard end of a run. Personally, I really enjoy this aspect of roguelikes, as it's still at least mostly possible to finish a bad run RNG with enough skill and patience. The variety and the challenges you face in-game makes the game feel more fresh on every run, and the rarity of insanely broken runs makes the insanely broken runs feel all the more insanely broken. But to perfectly close out this section of my argument, even with the craziest of crack runs, like my old grandpappy used to say, sometimes you just get sniped by an elite Blaze out of Lumerian, you know? So far, I've talked about actual documentable reasons roguelikes feel so difficult, but this next aspect I want to address is a bit more psychological. Firstly, to get to the crux of this portion of my argument, we need to discuss a central piece of pretty much every game genre out there: defeat. Game over, failure, that, however you want to call it, defeat is present in pretty much every game genre out there, and for good reason. A game often relies on there being something that is failable, something that roadblocks a user from just progressing without inhibition, and losing to that inevitable roadblock brings with it a sense of defeat in the player. This feeling of failure is then usually a method of pushing the player to overcome whatever challenge the game presented, creating a self-rewarding loop. When you die to a boss or fail a mission or mess up a puzzle or something, you get that sinking feeling of defeat. But once you overcome what you were stuck on, you are gratified by finally beating it and progressing past that area permanently, ready to take on the next challenge. There is often no need for you to, at least in the near future, return back to the level or section you just passed because you beat it. You have the opportunity to see on a world map or achievement list or etc. that you have cleared that section or done that thing or whatever, and can rest easy knowing that the struggle is over, and use that sense of accomplishment to fuel you to push on through the other trials the game holds. This accomplishment gratification is a big reason people play video games in general. The feeling of finally finishing something you've worked so hard towards and being able to move past it is great. It's a large reason that many games have attainable ends or breaks in their gameplay, whether that be the end of a story, the end of getting all achievements, the end of playing a certain amount of time, etc. Even in the case of infinite games like competitive shooters, they often have something to ultimately work towards, some end goals to reach like achievements or ranks or charms. Roguelikes, being a game genre, also try to satisfy this urge of working towards and reaching an end goal. However, a big difference between roguelikes and other game genres, and a reason that they feel so difficult, is the rate at which you can accomplish the game's goals, of which, for roguelikes, is super long. Roguelikes are at their core a game that takes a couple of hours to beat, but must be stretched to last factors of 10 or more hours. As I stated before, this is often done in part by making the game difficult to play, which then slows down your progression through the game on every run. However, when you slow down or potentially come to a standstill in progression, the feeling of gratification you get with new item and weapon unlocks and area clears and the such begins to diminish, and is overweighed by a sense of defeat from the constant repeated deaths you undertake. Especially when you're just starting out and haven't finished a run before, playing through a roguelike and replaying and dying so many times without making notable progression can really start to make getting to your next goal feel unfeasible, let alone reaching the overall task of finishing a run. Even if you do finally beat a distance boss or get through a new area or hit some other landmark, when you most likely die afterwards in the run, you are immediately hit with the reality that you will have to go back and do it again, losing the sense of accomplishment you worked so hard to get. Getting stuck can really feel like you're banging your head into a wall with roguelikes because of how few and far between the finite accomplishments are compared to the unlimited failures that you can experience. Unlike other game genres, the roguelike sometimes feels unnaturally difficult, not because of anything documentable, but simply because the imbalance of way more defeats can outweigh the player's limited accomplishments. Now, that isn't to say roguelikes are this hellscape of absolutely no progression. Many have permanent progression baked in, like permanent item unlocks, leveling, and abilities that the player gets rewarded for getting far enough into a run, which satisfies a cemented step of accomplishment to bounce off of. But some roguelikes with less noticeable boosts from permanent progressions can make you really feel like you're stuck a lot, especially in the beginning when you have no idea what's going on and what to do. It's like when I go to sleep, finally convincing myself that I made something of a contribution in my job and satisfied at its end, only to wake up the next day realizing I have to do the whole thing again, forgetting any work I may have done, plus remembering I have to fix whatever mess I made the day before just trying to be helpful. Alright, I want to end this discussion with one final reason I think roguelikes are so difficult, and this reason acts like sort of a summary of the others I put forth as of yet. A roguelike is at its core a genre that you play on repeat. It's a game that in actuality takes a couple of hours at most to complete, however it must extend itself into tens of hours of gameplay, and the big way it accomplishes this is by requiring you to replay the game over and over and over again. Of course, the player needs motivation to do this, and the games often give this through providing a plethora of mechanics, skills, and attributes that must be tirelessly trained to master, randomly generated runs on every run to make the game feel fresh and replayable, and permanent progression to encourage you to keep replaying the game to get more rewards. But most importantly, roguelikes are hard. That's right, what I'm proposing is roguelikes are so hard in large part because they have to be. The difficulty of roguelikes is often what causes players to have to keep replaying the game over and over and over again, because the biggest motivation the game can offer to the player is, well, the attempt at beating the game, working endlessly to get a run that finally completes the hour or two long game, and the subsequent games on higher difficulty scalings after that. If all roguelikes were incredibly easy to beat right from the get-go, then the replayability of the games would be severely diminished, because all the hours of work that is normally spent learning and mastering the game, getting good RNG in a run, and utilizing permanent progression would effectively be neutralized, because you wouldn't need all of that if you could just beat the game without any trouble. And if the replayability of roguelikes was diminished from this lack of time using purpose in the game, then the games would only have an average playtime of maybe a couple hours, a huge slap in the face to the otherwise factors of more hours of content the game may have to offer. Now, this isn't to say that every roguelike has to be this super mega Dark Souls 99% of players can't do this level of impossible, but fundamentally the reason a lot of roguelikes are so difficult is because they need to be to take the games from 2 to 3 hour pastimes to 100+ hour masterpieces. Of course, way more goes into the longevity of a roguelike than just difficulty, but difficulty, especially initially, is a large piece of the longevity puzzle. I mean, there's a reason the whole genre is notorious for difficulty, not just a couple of games. Its necessity wraps up every point I've talked about so far: the learning curve, RNG, defeat and success, and gives it a sense of purpose that motivates the player to learn and master, to progress and upgrade, to pray to RNGesus. It's a crucial component that allows these characteristics of roguelikes to be fun and rewarding, and one that makes me love the genre so much. It adds such a sense of gratification to the game, one that makes the many hours spent on it all worthwhile. All the feeling of the game being impossible to learn, annoyingly unfair, incredibly slow to progress through, it lets me push through all of that feeling and just keep trying over and over and over again to beat the damn game, then do it again and again and again. It really is an ingenious formula, making the learning curve, RNG, progression, and more enjoying and worthwhile, taking such a short experience and making it last so long. And it's one of, if not the biggest reason, I love the roguelike genre overall so much. That and this. This is also fun. But what do you think, dear viewer? Are roguelikes really that difficult? Am I over-explaining a relatively simple and mundane aspect of roguelikes? Am I underplaying other aspects that make roguelikes difficult? Or is difficulty really not so essential and important to the overall goodness of a roguelike at all? Please, let me know in the comments and... already? So sorry, I gotta go now, I'm running late for the ceremony. Drop a sub if you like the content and want to see more, have a good day, and see you later.